Our third presenter is Brandi Hudson. Brandi holds a Master of Arts degree in counseling with an emphasis in spiritual formation from Mid-American Nazarene University. Brandi is a licensed professional counselor in Kansas and a member of the Christian Association for Psychological Studies, Kansas Counseling Association, and Chi Sigma Iota Academic and Professional Honor Society. Brandi counsels women of all ages in the areas of anxiety, depression, addiction, life transition, relational issues, and Christian spiritual formation. Before becoming a licensed professional counselor, Brandi served as a volunteer Bible study leader for women in drug and alcohol recovery and carries a continued passion for seeing women walk with purpose and joy-filled lives. Brandi's presentation is on the art of silence.
Hi, everyone. This is so different, right? But by now you're on your third day, probably, and you're very used to it. So excuse me, I'm on my first day. And so I wish so much I could see all of your faces instead of mine, but that's not the case. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. And whether you're actually watching it live right now or if you're watching it later in the week, I'm really excited to be here with you guys and share something that I feel like has been life-changing in my own life and in my client's life. So as we go through this time, obviously it's on silence. So there are going to be 3 periods of silence. So just to warn you right now, we will have that. And I do want to encourage you. I think since you're watching this at home, it's going to be really easy to maybe go change the laundry or check your email during those periods. And I want to encourage you not to do that. I want to encourage you to sit in the silence, sit in the prompts that we're going to do and we're going to discuss and see what comes up. And it also, if nothing comes up, it could be a really great just self-care, right? This is what this whole event is about, is self-care. So I'm excited, and I guess we'll get started. I'm going to show my PowerPoint. You should be seeing something. Maybe. We're working on it. While they're working on it, let me just tell you a little bit more about myself. Holly introduced a lot about me, and I graduated from Mid-America Nazarene University with a clinical mental health counseling background and an emphasis in spiritual formation. And how I actually even got into this and decided I wanted to be a therapist was going through my own stuff, right? And starting to be with other women while they were going through their stuff and doing that on a volunteer basis. And just decided a few years ago, I guess several years ago at this point, to actually start doing it for a living. So we're working on it. Okay. So yeah, so why I chose silence. While I was in graduate school, I was still working a full-time job and doing clinical hours and going to school, and in that period of time was getting married and becoming a stepmom, and life was literally chaotic. And it was chaotic in a good way, but it was still chaotic. And I felt as if I needed some silence. I just needed some stillness. And since we're talking about spirituality today, my faith is really what spurred me on of using silence as a discipline. And it worked wonders. It really did work wonders. And I started doing it in small amounts at the beginning of each day, maybe at lunch, and then at the end of each day, of just literally having no noise and just being still in the silence. And it did a lot. And I'll get into that further in the presentation of the benefits of it. But also during this time, I started noticing it in therapy and with my clients. I had one client in particular who loved the silence. And honestly, if we could have sat in silence a lot of the session, he would have loved that. And he would come to profound insight after being in the silence. And honestly, for me, it was a little uncomfortable. And I had to address that within myself, but for him therapeutically, it did wonders. I also, are we, okay. Okay, we're back. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, we can see the PowerPoint. Okay, it's gonna look a little bit different, but that's okay, right? Because that's the world we're living in. So last thing I was saying, and if you are catching this on a later date, the Amazing Resolve people are going to piece together what we talked about for the first 5 minutes and pick up now. But what I was saying is I had one client who really enjoyed silence. He felt like a lot of productivity came from it. And then I had another client who it was almost if I could tangibly see a physical reaction happening to her body whenever we would have silence. And she would even say things like, why are you being silent? And call it out. And so it really got me thinking of, first off, how can I use silence in my own life to have self-care and to be a better therapist? And then also, how can I use it in my client's life? So that's where this presentation came from. As you can see on your screen, this quote I love, just like sleep restores the body, silence restores the mind, the emotions, and the soul. So I know you guys have had already probably some alone time. Well, let's see how we're gonna get, okay, here we go. But we are gonna take now 5 minutes. And I know that might sound like a lot, but we're gonna take 5 minutes and just sit in some silence. And I want you to really just try an experience to like let go of any expectations, let go of trying to focus on something or to clear your mind of things, and just be still in silence and see what you notice, see what you hear. You know, you might even reflect a little bit on what your past 24 hours have looked like. Have they looked jam-packed, or has there been intentional periods of silence and solitude and more peaceful moments? Or has it just been crazy? And maybe this is the first time you have sat in silence, not only in 24 hours, but maybe in a week or a month. So we're going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to set a little alarm. It's going to probably seem long for some of you and short for others. So we'll be in silence for 5 minutes. Okay, I don't know if that was a full quite 5 minutes, but we're also trying to make up some time from our little technical difficulties. So you guys maybe you got out a little easy on that one, but I would love to hear, honestly, how that was for everyone. Obviously we can't do that. So I can just tell you how it was for me. I do silence a lot, so it's something I'm really familiar with. However, even in this time, it was hard for me to sit in it. Obviously, I have 3 other people in the room, and I'm wondering, like, how are they feeling? Like, the presentation just got all wonky. Like, are they okay? Or there is like a heater right above us, and you can hear that. And on one hand, it sounds really soothing. It actually sounds like the fan I use whenever we go to sleep. And so I'm like, okay, don't get too relaxed. You still need to present. But it was hard for me. It was hard for me just to sit in the silence and be still, if I'm going to be honest, with that first 5 minutes. So I hope it was better for you guys. But honestly, if it's not, I think it really brings up things for you to even have insight on and awareness on and to work through. So as we move to our next slide, obviously, if we're going to talk about silence, we need to talk about the opposite of silence, which is noise. So love this quote: never let the noise of the world overpower the stillness of your soul. It's pretty powerful. So what is noise pollution? The presence of intrusive and unnecessary sounds that can seriously influence human health and mental health and physical health. So whenever I was doing research for this about noise and how it can actually affect our bodies, it was so interesting how many studies are actually out there talking about this and what they're finding. And so as you can see on the screen, the World Health Organization, they released a study and they found at least 1 million healthy years of life are lost each year in Europe alone due to noise pollution. I also found another study about children who go to school, like say in New York City and downtown New York City, and how their levels of reading and comprehension are almost unanimously behind others in more rural areas because the train is always going and then they can't hear and then they have to stop and they get sidetracked and distracted. So it's super interesting what noise pollution can even do for our bodies. It's, as you can see on the slide, it's increased anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, heart disease, cognitive impairment, and stroke. And so why are we talking about this as therapists or as helpers? We see people every day who struggle with anxiety and depression. And if there's a tangible, easy fix that can even help them a little bit of eliminating some noise, we should know about it. So it can also, last point, cause poor concentration, difficulties in communicating, and then fatigue from lack of sleep. So science is actually starting to show that continual noise is a powerful catalyst in creating elevated levels of stress hormones and then the overstimulation of our amygdala. And as we all know, as helpers, the amygdala is so important in our mental health and how it's used for stress regulation and emotional responses and memories. And so when our amygdala is consistently overstimulated, pathways are activated that drive blood vessel inflammation and all types of other sorts of mental health issues and just physical body issues as well. Okay, so since we just took our 5 minutes of silence, we're going to pause on this one for a second and get through a few more slides. And I can come back to this, but we are going to take 5 minutes here in a few minutes and put on music, turn on your TV, listen to a podcast, and actually have some type of background noise that would be happening if you were just sitting at your house on a regular day. Maybe your TV is on, or you can hear the kids playing in the room, or you have your Alexa on playing music. So do that. It doesn't need to be super loud, just regular tone. And then we're going to follow some prompts and you're going to see the difference. So we're going to do this with noise, and then we're also going to do it with silence later on. So I'll come back to this screen. Let's get through a few more slides and we'll come back to this and do this as well. So before I move on, the first code word, alert. The first code word is lion. First code word is lion. Write that down. Okay, we'll come back to this slide. So silence and healing. How can silence be used to heal our bodies and our minds and our spirits? So love this. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone throughout the earth and their words to all the world. And that's from the Bible in Psalm 19. That scripture honestly resonates so well to me of we do not have to be constantly talking to get a point across. We do not have to have noise all the time for things to change. And so I thought that was really kind of imperative to what we're studying right now in silence. So more studies. I never realized how many studies on silence there were until I actually started studying it myself. But a biologist from Duke University found that 2 hours of silence a day prompts cell development. Hello, we all want that, right? That can help us learn better, remember, have more awareness of our emotions and better regulation of our emotions. Attention restoration theory, which is pretty cool theory in counseling, posits that environments with lower levels of sensory input give the brain the ability to recover some of its cognitive abilities. So when we are actually sitting in silence, our brain is healing. The biological parts of our brain are healing. As we talked about earlier, just as noise raises your blood pressure, silence can lower your blood pressure. It can improve your memory. It can relieve tension. And I actually had a hard time with this next study because I love listening to music and I feel like I listen to some level of music in the background often. But a study done by Hart revealed that 2 minutes of complete silence was actually more beneficial than listening to relaxing music. And that was determined by the participants' improved blood pressure and blood circulation in their brains when they were doing that test. And so I think that's kind of counterintuitive. Sometimes we're like, turn on some relaxing music, take a bubble bath. Like these are things we do to relax, which are all good things. And what would it look like if you did that in silence? What would that look like for your brain health and your body health to do that in silence? So, okay, this is another quote. I had so many quotes in this that I found and that I love, but I think this one is so imperative. So I'm going to read the full quote. It says, "The soul is like a wild animal, tough, resilient, resourceful, savvy, self-sufficient. It knows how to survive in a hard place, but it is also shy. Just like a wild animal, it seeks safety in the dense underbrush. If we want to see a wild animal, we know that the last thing we should do is go crashing through the woods, yelling for it to come out. But if we walk quietly into the woods, sit patiently at the base of the tree, and fade into our surroundings, the wild animal we seek might put in an appearance." I feel like that quote has just so much depth to it and so much resonance, and not only for our own lives, but for the lives of our clients, that in sitting in silence, what is actually going to come up that needs to come up, that's been wanting to come up, that since we've been causing it to sit still and sit down has been causing us anxiety or depression or whatnot, because right, our body keeps a score. Who knows the book? It will come out on some level. And so when we sit in the silence, maybe it'll just appear on its own. And so silence can bring a huge awareness of what needs healed in our life. It can also allow a deepening of insight into oneself and one's circumstances and environment. It allows for our imagination and daydreaming to take place. You know, I think when we look at kiddos, and if you do any type of therapy with kiddos, helping them to use their imagination and creativity can be such a healing thing. So I think as adults, we need to take note of that and use it more often. Because in that, we can approach life's problems with new and creative solutions. If we just give ourselves space to really be silent. So we're going to go back now to the other previous slide. Yeah. And look at, well, we can do it right here. Look at the prompts. Since this is a spiritual day, I gave spiritual prompts. The first prompt is, my spiritual growth or lack of have any positive or negative impact on my profession. So think about that. Have you been avoiding spirituality in your life? Has it something that you've chased after? And how is that impacting you as someone in the helping field? Second prompt, you can choose whichever one you want. Am I filled with faith, hope, and love, and live without anger, greed, guilt, envy, or thoughts of revenge? I think this is such an insightful prompt of where are you at right now spiritually, and how are you living? And prompt 3, where does my ultimate truth, peace, and trust lie? So these are going to be our 3 prompts. Folks, I brought my AirPods. These are not AirPods. Do you guys have music that you're going to listen to, or do you want me to put on something right here, or? You have music? Okay. So get prepared, whether you turn on your TV or listen to some type of music. For mine, I'm going to listen to a podcast, because I think sometimes when I am listening to music, your thoughts tend to veer to where the music is going. So if I'm listening to a song about like surrender, all my thoughts, like with these prompts, would turn towards, okay, if I could just surrender more, if I could just let go more. And I don't want it to be navigated or, purposely going in one direction. So I'm going to listen to a podcast about literally nothing to do with spirituality is what I'm going to do for the next 5 minutes. So, okay, here we go. Okay, we are done with the second 5-minute period. So I don't know how that was for you guys, but for me, if I'm going to be really honest, it was so distracting. I actually chose a podcast on finance to be listening to. And so to be honest, I would like, I'm staring at the prompts. And so I'm trying to focus. I chose prompt 2 to focus on. And then they started talking about like student loan debt. And then my brain went to like, how much student loan debt I have now with school. And like, it was so hard to focus. And so I don't know what it was like for you guys, whether you had a TV, podcast, or music, but was it hard to focus? Take note. Was it hard to focus on actually something that is really important? Our spiritual health is so important. And can you do that with the distraction of the noise? I think at one point in time, they even mentioned the election on the podcast that I was listening to. And so then, of course, my brain is going in a whole nother direction. And I was like, this is just such a clear picture of how we are living our life with the radio on, the TV on, all the opinions of social media. And are we even giving ourself space to just be and really focus on what's going on inside of us? So hold on to that. We'll get back to those prompts one last time before we end today. Oop. Oh, the tab works just okay. Amen. Okay, so silence in therapy. How can this be used in therapy? I think probably a lot of you are either social workers or counselors or in some type of the helping field. And so I thought it would be super beneficial to talk about how we can even use this with our clients. So 2 things. I recently used it in a session with a client who is really struggling with a huge life decision. And we took several minutes and she would just sit there and imagine, sitting in silence, imagine what her life would look like if she made the one decision. And then paused, talked about it, reflected, and then took another several minutes. And then she imagined what her life would be like if she made the opposite decision. And she said it was hard in the beginning, right? Just to be in the room with me, because it is a little bit more awkward when someone else is in the room. Be in the room with me and trying to be in silence, and and we talked about the awkwardness. And I think that is something that you need to do that we'll kind of get into in a little bit, but it brought her a lot of insight of, okay, here's actually like when I give myself space to just be and think through the situation, what kind of decision I actually want to make. And taking the time of just being by herself and sitting in the silence, obviously with me, was really helpful for her. So I've seen it used a lot in therapy. I'll give some other stories later on, but that's just one of them. I also think that, so last time I put on this presentation, we were in person. And so what we did, instead of using the spiritual prompts, the second time we sat in silence, we sat with a partner, and you were just looking at your partner for 5 minutes. So you can imagine how awkward that felt for so many people. Actually, the person I did it with is sitting in the room right now. And it was so interesting, the conversations we were having after doing that exercise of even the attunement. So like when one partner would maybe smile, well, then their partner is now smiling. Or I think one partner ship started getting the giggles and like could not stop laughing. And so it was just interesting to see what each partnership group said they noticed. And I know for me, with my partner, her glasses, and even now looking at you, I'm like, her glasses had like a pink tint to them, and everything with like her hair, and I think her makeup and her glasses, like all just flowed so well. And how many times had I seen her right past her all the time in the halls, talk to her, and never really noticed that. But then taking the time out to just be with someone and attune to them without having the expectation of speaking anything or hearing anything or having any type of conversation brings so much awareness to stuff that maybe you didn't even notice before. And so I think that's where silence in therapy is so helpful for us as clinicians and so helpful for our clients, because it helps us to bring into awareness what is actually going on. Okay, so I'm going to use two words when we're talking about silence in therapy, productive and obstructive client silences. So another study was completed where they were making associations between a productive silence from the client and an obstructive client silence, and how that clearly showed like the client counselor attachment, the working therapeutic alliance, even treatment outcomes could be assessed based on these types of pauses, is what they would call them. So if you've never heard of this, basically a productive pause is where the client pauses to reflect on an issue, to immerse themselves in the feelings of an experience, of an emotion, to search for the right words to express their thoughts or feelings. So that's a productive pause. An obstructive pause is where the client is disengaging. They're either disengaging from their emotions or from the therapy process. This can also mean that the client doesn't know how to respond maybe to a therapeutic intervention that you're using. So with that, how do we notice these pauses? And then how can we actually facilitate them? So I think in noticing obstructive pauses, and I would love to hear your guys' feedback on this because I know you guys have probably witnessed this as well, but how I have seen obstructive pauses happen in therapy is sometimes their face will just like go blank, right? Like you're attuning to your client's face and their facial expressions, and you can just like sometimes see like a glassy look. And then that's right when I know, like, okay, let me either pause or backtrack or figure out what's going on, because this pause that they're doing is a disengagement. It's not an engagement in therapy. Also looking confused. I think as an intern, which I interned at Resolve, shout out, it was great. But as an intern, you're trying all these new therapy things you're learning in the room. And sometimes, especially probably in the beginning, maybe you're not explaining it as well, or it's not going as well as you would like. And the client is just lost, right? They're kind of like, well, what's even the point of this, right? And so noticing that, noticing their pause in that. So that's obstructive. They're disengaging. Productive. I think facilitating productive pauses is something that we as therapists need to absolutely be doing. When we can see the benefit in silence and therapy, we need to be bringing it to our client, because chances are the client is going to feel awkward when we are having silence. In fact, I literally, this is so funny. I counsel a lot of teen girls and have a great relationship with this client. And I really felt like I needed to start using more silence in therapy with her. And so this is a while back. She made a comment about something that was super profound. And so I just sat there in the silence with it. And she goes, "Why are you staring at me?" And I was like, okay. And so, we had to laugh about it. And then I was able to tell her and engage in that of like, this is what silence can do. And even pushing into like the awkward of like, I know this probably feels really awkward for you. And even admitting as a therapist how it can feel awkward for us too, I think allows the client to see like, okay, I don't have to be totally comfortable with this to utilize it and to see its benefit. So a few things when I'm feeling like we need to have a productive pause, you can say, let's sit in this feeling for a minute. Let's sit in this emotion that you're feeling for a minute. Or a simple, like, let's just pause there for a second. And it gives the client a chance to really discover what is going on inside of them, because I think so often our body recognizes what's happening before our minds have a second to catch up. And so it gives them that space to just pause and feel the emotion and let their mind catch up to what their body already knows. So silence actually is an expression of communication, right? We think that communication is verbal and you need to actually be speaking, but silence is an expression. As you see on the PowerPoint, it can be connecting. It can convey empathy and respect and support. How often have you guys been with a client that has gone through a traumatic experience and is really suffering, and honestly, you just don't feel like you even have the words to hold it? And so how do you hold it? You hold it with your presence in the midst of silence. It can be inviting. It can challenge the client to take responsibility for what's actually going on inside of them. when you, and just to be transparent, when we as therapists are not comfortable with silence, we're not going to use it, right? And so we're going to save the client when there could be a moment where the client really needs to be invited into feeling something and taking responsibility over something, of whether it be an emotion or a thought, whatever it may be. And there's a period of silence. You start to feel your client get awkward. And so what do we do if we're not comfortable in it? We jump in and save. We throw out a question. We throw out something we're noticing versus just sitting in it. So we as therapists need to be aware of that. Are we in a way kind of hindering some growth of our clients because we ourselves are not comfortable with the silence that they need to actually process through a tough emotion or whatnot? So it can link things. It can bring an awareness. It facilitates the client's reflection or expression of their own feelings. It can also be a check-in. Assess the client's status. I love this. I'm consistently doing this in the beginning of therapy. Like, how are you right now? What is your body feeling like right now? Where are we at right now? Checking in throughout the session. How is this? How is our relationship feeling right now? What are you experiencing right now? And you need all of that. To do all of that, you need to have some silence. Because if we're just constantly talking, it's probably passing over what they're actually feeling. Checking in at the end of session always. What was this like for you? Reprocessing through what you guys talked about in session and giving them space to feel it, to sit in it, and to be with it. And that requires silence. So I think also being aware of your client's view on silence. I'm always talking with my clients about what is actually going on in the room right now. And that also includes when there are silent pauses, like, what did that feel like for you? Did that feel awkward? Did that make you feel nervous? Did you love that? Do you want more of that? Knowing where your client stands on silence is going to be so important to how you as a therapist are able to use it. Using silence for clients who are actively problem solving. As we talked about earlier, our imagination and the creativity that we carry can be used in such a great way to problem solve. So this fact I saw, I was like, what? 93% of communication is nonverbal, whether it's through our facial expressions, our gestures, our postures, right? One of the first things we learned in grad school was like solar, like how are you sitting, right? And how are you presenting yourself? And how often when you're in therapy with your client is your face almost mimicking what's going on with theirs, or you're trying to help regulate them. So maybe you're taking your facial expressions to a different area. But either way, if you just sat in therapy, like, you probably aren't going to have a lot of clients, honestly. So being aware what is going on your face, how are you communicating with your body? These are all so important. Okay, self-care, here we are, right? And this is why we've all been tuning in for the past 3 days. So silence in self-care. Love this quote. The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear. So the difference between silence and meditation. I know with our prompts, our spiritual prompts, that probably did feel a little bit more like meditation because there's an intention behind it. And really that's the biggest difference. Silence is just essentially abstaining from any noise. Meditation can involve stilling your thoughts or stilling your mind from thoughts, focusing your mind on something, whether it be your body, your breath, God. Also mindfulness may like noticing where your mind is wandering to and why it's wandering there and where it wanders. So those are really the differences. Silence is literally just having zero noise. So I know with our experiments, it probably does feel a little bit more like meditation, but we had to improvise because we can't see each other face to face. So with silence and self-care, really silence can be used anytime and anywhere. Whether you are doing the dishes and you decide, okay, typically the TV's on in the background, turn it off. Or when you're taking a shower, right? Like we can have music everywhere, like the speaker in the shower now. How many of us have one of those? I don't, but I would love one. I think it'd be great. And so, but how many times even in that, like I always bring my phone in the bathroom and I'm listening to music while I'm taking a shower or getting ready. So even having silence in those periods of time, self-care. So like I said at the very beginning of this presentation, how I started incorporating silence into my self-care routine was by spending the first 15, 20 minutes of the day at lunch and then before bed in silence, not checking my phone, not even mentally skimming like things I have to get done today or things that happened today, not watching TV, just literally being in silence and abstaining from all noise. I think it's also really helpful if you're finding yourself feeling overwhelmed throughout your day, like take a silence break. Leave your phone inside, go for a walk, and just be outside in silence on a walk. Like I said, you can incorporate it in everyday tasks, whether you're driving, cleaning, reading, getting ready, whatever it may be. And I think, even incorporating it in our household. With the pandemic, all of us have been basically in our house for the past 7-8 months on a consistent basis. And so I think incorporating silence into your routine with your family can be so important in the atmosphere of your house and having a peaceful atmosphere in your home versus one that it's chaotic and it feels like it's so noisy and loud. And so maybe even as a family saying, okay, before dinner, we're going to take 15 minutes of silence and we can all sit in the living room together, or like everyone can go to their room, whatever it may be, but there's zero TV, zero devices, and just sitting in the silence. So I would encourage you and challenge you to do that. Okay, before we move on, attention, the second code word is lamb, L-A-M-B, lamb. So the first code word was lion, second code word was lamb. All right. Okay, silence and spirituality. Oh, this quote, silence for our spiritual life is like the space inside the body of a violin. It is what allows the music to resonate. Whenever I first did this presentation a while back, this part was not involved. Actually, the presentation would have been over. But since we are on the day of spirituality, we are going to talk about spirituality and silence in that. My initial thought was for this to be more of a conversation. However, since we can't be together or even talk on this level, it's not going to get to be that. So I do believe in authenticity, and even in session, I think bringing my authentic self helps the client bring their authentic self. And so while silence has been used in spirituality, so many different faith traditions for centuries, just used as a spiritual practice for rest and renewal. How I have learned about it and how I have studied it is through the Christian lens. I recognize that not everyone is a Christian listening to this, and so I didn't want to be exclusive to that at all. So with that, I do want to preface that how I studied it and how I feel like I can talk about it is through that lens. However, whatever spiritual faith you decide or you practice from, I want you to incorporate all of this through that lens, obviously. So it enhances the capacity for contemplation. So whether you are Muslim, a Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, atheist, agnostic, it doesn't matter. Whatever you are, it's going to be able to enhance your contemplation for who your higher power is. It can help restore peace and clarity to a weary soul. I think also if we backtrack for a minute to how we use silence in the therapy session, knowing your client's take on spirituality, I think is something that is so often overlooked and not in a good way. Everyone has some type of belief, whether it's no belief or whether it's a belief in God as a Christian with Jesus, or it's a belief in Buddha, like whatever it is, you have some type of belief, even if it's nothing. And that matters. It matters in therapy. It matters as you're looking at your client through a holistic lens. And so also knowing that if they do practice from a spiritual standpoint, a different spiritual standpoint, knowing that in therapy is going to be so helpful, because you're going to be able to give them tools that fit with their own faith tradition that they can work on and grow that aspect of their life as well too. So how do you even practice this? You find an intentional and sacred space to practice it. Be intentional and keep that time. We have a closet designated in our house that is where we go to be in silence, be in solitude, have it be sacred, and be intentional with listening. It may be so tempting to fill this time with music, and even if that is helpful at some points, when we're talking about silence, be intentional with not filling the void, and then push through. I think a lot of times, especially when I started practicing this spiritual discipline, I felt like I was wasting my time. I felt like nothing was happening. And then the more that I pushed through that, the more that I was able to recognize that actually things are happening. And it has been a game changer in my life as how I carry peace and how I carry attunement to God. And that has, been a game changer through that. So I don't know if we have time to do the last 5 minutes of the silence, or do we have a lot of questions, or can we do the last 5 minutes? Let's do the questions. So remember the prompt that you did, whether it was by recognizing what was going inside of you, or what do I even actually put my trust in, or whichever prompt you used in the beginning with the music. I want to encourage you at some point today, sit through that same prompt, but sit in it with silence and see how different it may be for you. So I think I also want to say that there's one more slide. Sorry. This is what I wanted to discuss if we were in person. That is silence a part of your spiritual practice? If so, could you practice spirituality without it? Could you practice your spirituality without silence? If silence isn't a part of it, could your spirituality be improved by adding the discipline of silence? And then what role does remaining silent play in your spirituality? So think on those things too. If you have any thoughts on that, I think, can they say their thoughts on it now? And I would love to share those with the group. If you have practiced a certain spirituality and practice the discipline of silence, I would love to hear that and share that with everyone, because I think we all bring something to the table. And so being able to share that is important. Yeah. Okay.
Lovely, Brandi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I had the honor of sitting in her in-person presentation.
Yeah.
And I remember the torture I felt by having to stare into this person's eyes that I didn't even know. I barely knew her name.
Yeah.
And I had to like stare at her for 5 minutes, and it was super awkward. But at the end, and since then, I felt super connected to this person.
Yes.
And so it was really incredible. So thank you so much for modifying it for us today. It's really interesting because sitting in those first 5 minutes of silence, I generally use, I like how you distinguish the difference between silence and meditation, because I actually use it more as a meditative practice when you initially encourage us to try that. And so I normally, when I'm meditating, I use like a breathing pattern. And so I noticed after a certain time period, my breathing pattern changed. It slowed down. It was deeper, like that parasympathetic really triggered it.
Yes.
And then also about like the exact amount of breaths later, my body just totally like relaxed. And I was like, when you called to stop, I was like, oh no. So it was really good. So thank you so much for that.
Yep.
In terms of the noise activity, I couldn't even do it because I went to get on YouTube and I have songs on my phone, and I went to get on YouTube and there were bullet floods, and I was like, I can't even do that.
Yeah, it's so hard.
So, and I've noticed too, like after work, after a long day, when I get in my car, I will not listen to anything.
And if I do, it's classical music very, very low. Whereas normally when I'm driving into work, I have on NPR or I'm talking to someone on the phone. And so I think that is just a really good example of like, I need to reset after a day of work, and that silence or that really calm, quiet music. I guess that's not silence, is it? It's really helpful. Personally. One question that we had was, do different cultures view silence differently?
Yeah. And so I think I'm going to look at it through a spiritual lens, spiritual culture.
Sure.
And absolutely. And like I said earlier, how I know, from a Christian lens, how we view silence is more of like attuning and hearing from God, versus something internal happening. It's more of the relationship and attuning to Him. I know for different religions and different cultures on that, it can be more of like a stillness in your body and stilling your mind and having, you know, your mind and your body and your soul really becoming into an alignment. And so I think that is the big difference that I can tell right now with like culturally spiritual differences. And I think that's also so important to know where your client stands with that.
Yeah.
Right. And to know, you know, because we're all so different. What I believe about silence in my spiritual culture is probably completely different than a lot of my clients. And so being aware of their viewpoint on it and how their spiritual culture is so important so that you can incorporate it to help them, regardless if it's how you practice or not.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point. I was traveling and was in Japan, and I noticed I was sitting on a bus, and the bus was full, and it was completely silent. Completely silent. Everybody was just sitting quietly. Also on their trains, their Shinto trains, it was just completely silent. And I was with another American who was very unaware of kind of cultural rules and that kind of stuff. And she was talking very loud. Everybody was like looking at her. And I think just being aware of different cultural norms and respect and that kind of stuff in terms of silence, I think that can be really, really powerful.
Absolutely.
I guess the last question that I was going to ask is, how do I overcome the discomfort of silence? So you did a really good job, like differentiating productive versus obstructive. And you kind of gave us some tips for how to practice and kind of like, but I was wondering, like, do you set boundaries around the time that you take to practice silence? Like, what are the kind of the first steps you take to like, because otherwise I think it could be really hard to do that.
Yes. And so I think setting the time frame that you think is doable. So if 5 minutes feels doable, if 1 minute feels doable, do the 1 minute, right? And then work your way up to something that feels more doable. But pushing through the awkward is so important. And even with clients, pushing through the awkward. And I think if we're going to do that with someone else, we have to start doing it with ourselves first, right? And not even necessarily the awkward, but even like the boredom. Right? We live in such a world that it's like, we have this to do, that to do. We have all these like crazy to-do lists. And so when we're just sitting there in silence, even for 5 minutes, it seems like we're almost wasting our time.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yes. And so pushing through that and recognize that you're not wasting your time, that this is beneficial for your mind, your body, your spirit, your soul. And then also acknowledging, especially with client, acknowledging that it's weird. It can feel weird when you start doing this.
Validating that.
And validating it.
Feels weird to me too.
Yes, that, you know, in doing this, it can feel different if you've never practiced it. And it can feel weird of, well, what is that person thinking right now while we're sitting here? And I think just acknowledging it, you know, in therapy, we say a lot of the times, like, in order to tame it, you have to name it. And so I think that's the same with this, of acknowledging that it might be awkward and it might feel strange and it might feel like a waste of your time, and processing through that could probably bring up a whole slew of things to talk about in therapy anyways. So
probably good tips for those clinicians too. Brandi, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for taking time to come in and teach us about the art of silence. We are now going to take a temporary break. We're going to actually close down the webinar just so